Over the years, I've collected a large number of cases from various sources: books, newsletters, newspapers, and podcasts. Many of these cases are quite obscure and are rarely discussed by anyone. Woven together, they offer an interesting insight into just how strange the paranormal is and how anyone can have an experience. I'm going to go through some of the more intriguing cases I've collected. Some are very strange. Some you might have heard of. The only thing I'm going to say is, keep an open mind. On January 6, 1953, an arrow-headed shaped object was sighted for 2 hours over Dallas, Texas. It was a bright object described as, quote, green, orange, and red, with a nose which gave out a white light. The object also produced a whizzing noise. It was watched by crews of police cars and personnel of the airport control tower. It climbed 30,000 feet to 100,000 feet in seconds and then vanished from sight.
There has been this movement lately, I've noticed, in the UFO community. You might know who I'm talking about. That all these objects since the 40s and 50s and before that, all these objects that people are seeing flying around are man-made, which I don't personally believe. I don't care how many meetings you've had with Skunk Works or high-ranking government officials. I personally don't believe that. I believe that there's something else out there. I don't believe that in 1953 the U.S. government had an aircraft that could go from 30,000 to 100,000 feet in just a matter of seconds. But I could be wrong.
On January 27, 1953, a fighter pilot in Japan had a really close view of a strange metallic disc-shaped object, which made a controlled sweeping pass at another aircraft. He noted that it, quote, caught up with the jet, hovered a few moments, and then shot out of sight. It was said to have moved with a curious, flipping motion.
As we've all heard these saucer reports before, and typically these metallic discs spin and they fly around, but this is one of the first, probably one of the only reports I've heard where the disc-shaped object was seen to flip end over end. That's a first for me.
On February 8, 1953, in Zimbabwe, South Africa, a piece of metal was reported to have fallen out of the sky, landing with a, quote, swishing sound and a brilliant multicolored flash. It was examined by Dr. Graham White, a member of the British Interplanetary Society, according to the Rhodesia Herald. The object, a hollow metal cylinder, was warm when picked up by a railway official at Rusap at 1:10 a.m. It is unclear what the object was and what became of it.
Most likely skeptics will say, hey, this was just a piece of a plane that fell off. But typically, if something were to fall off a plane, it's not going to have a multicolored flash. So that's definitely unique to this case.
On November 8, 1957, in Waterloo, Iowa, Paul Rutledge, a packing house worker, reported seeing a glass-topped flying object hovering 30 feet over his garage. He said it was 50 feet long, football-shaped, and with a shiny bottom, and that he could see two shapes moving around inside. He ran to get another witness, a neighbor, Ed Jacobson, but when they returned, the object was gone, though a light could be seen moving in the sky. This account appeared in the Nebraska Fairbury Daily News.
Albert included this case in his humanoid journals because in the 1950s there really wasn't a lot of cases involving people seeing creatures or anything on board these crafts. They were seeing lots of lights in the sky and objects, but they weren't actually seeing what was inside of them. This was one of those rare cases where Rutledge said that he saw something, a couple of figures moving around inside of it.
On April 12, 1959, at the same time a UFO was being observed over a Royal Canadian Air Force base in Saint-Hubert, Quebec, Claude Mercier and 10 of his neighbors near a playing field in Montreal's North End watched as a big round object, 10 feet in diameter and with a yellow light inside, drifted over and nearly landed right there in the field. It appeared to be shooting sparks from its underside. It seemed to become aware of the witnesses and immediately took off at a slant into the sky. In the summer of 1965, John Seitz and his friends were out spotlighting deer in the woods near Franklin, West Virginia, when they observed a strange, hairy, bipedal creature. I was riding in the front passenger seat holding a powerful spotlight when the light fell on what we thought at first was a very large black bear, standing on its hind legs. The creature was about 30 yards away in a field, about 10 feet below the road we were on. At first it just stood there and looked at us, or rather, I should say, looked at the spotlight. I focused the light on its face and we immediately knew it was not a bear. It had an almost human-like face. It stood about 7 feet tall and was covered with long, dark hair. After about 10 seconds, the creature turned away from John and his friends and walked across the field towards the woods. Just before the woods was a split-rail fence. It climbed the fence, quote, just like a human would. Once it got over the fence, it turned and looked back at the group for about 5 seconds before turning and walking off into the forest. A few days later, we were again spotlighting and we saw it, or another one that looked like it. The creature was standing between an old church and a graveyard. We only saw it for about 5 seconds because it walked away very quickly.
If you read enough Bigfoot reports, you will notice that there's a lot of them. People claim to see these creatures, these Bigfoot creatures, either near an old church, an abandoned church, or near a graveyard. And it's not just Bigfoot reports; it's also Dogman reports. What is it about these places that attract these creatures? And is there some kind of a connection between religion and churches and death and afterlife and these creatures?
On April 24, 1966, in Olean, New York, a 12 to 14 foot diameter disc with red lights was observed by Robert Howard, 51, and John Orazio, 13, behind a barn. It drifted off over a swamp, which was later searched by area deputies, thinking it might have been a downed aircraft. They found nothing. The object was described as having white lights that slowly turned to red. This appeared in the Olean New York Times Herald.
If you go through the old newspaper clippings from the 50s and 60s and 70s, you will find a lot of reports in which search and rescue teams or police officers go out to a location to look for a downed aircraft. Because back then, people were seeing all kinds of things in the sky, and then they'd see them fall out of the sky, and they just assumed that it was either a helicopter or some kind of plane that was in trouble, and search teams would be sent out to look for the downed craft. And these types of cases are all through these old newspaper clippings. And it is this case here is just an example of that.
March 12, 1969, New Brunswick, Canada. Mr. and Mrs. Norman Preston, Mr. Gary Stairs, and neighbor Mrs. Frank Jocelyn watched as a rocket-like object very slowly flew over the Prestons' Prince William home. It reminded them of Apollo 9 and was well lit. They watched it for about 30 minutes before retreating into the house. When they went back out 20 minutes later, it was gone. This was reported in the Woodstock, New Brunswick Bugle.
The witnesses said that it looked like the Apollo 9. And what's really interesting is that the Apollo 9 actually came down one day after this sighting, March 13th, 1969. So is it possible that that's what these people saw? That said, they did say that it was hovering or moving over their house for 30 minutes, or upwards of 30 minutes. So it doesn't sound like the Apollo 9. I don't know.
On April 16, 1969, in Mentone, California, at around 9:10 p.m., Mrs. Helen Teeter was driving on Mill Creek Road near Garnet Street when she observed an object a few blocks over to the north paralleling her. It was shaped like a, quote, box knife with a flaming orange ball. Two men in a Volkswagen ahead of her stopped their car and began running towards the object as it descended toward the ground. Suddenly, the two men, apparently frightened, turned around and ran back to their car and left. It turned blue as it neared the ground, but it was obscured by bushes and trees of the north road. She drove closer to the spot where it had seemed to land, but found nothing. Peter was adamant that it was not a plane. This appeared in the Redlands, California Daily Fax newspaper.
She said that these two guys got out of their car and started running towards the object. And at some point they got too close to it, and they actually saw what it was and realized that it wasn't a plane and it wasn't a helicopter, and it scared them, and they turned around and ran back to their car and got out of there. Well, Teeter herself, she was so interested that she actually drove up to the scene where she thought it had landed and checked the area, and there was nothing there. You couldn't pay me to drive up to a possible landed UFO.
Dan Air Flight 1903 was a de Havilland Comet 4 aircraft operated by Dan Air Services Limited, and on July 3, 1970, crashed into the wooded slopes of the Serralada del Montseny in Arbuches in the province of Girona in Catalonia, Spain. The plane crew mistakenly gave the wrong location. At the same time, the Barcelona airport recorded a blip on their radar 20 miles north of the city, while the plane crashed into the mountain 40 miles away from that position. After an extensive all-night search over a wide area, rescue teams reached the crash site the following day. The Spanish authorities strangely insisted on an immediate burial of the bodies. They claimed that it was for public health reasons.
I wanted to include this case, and you can find a lot more info on it, just because it's interesting that this UFO was sighted at the exact moment that the plane was crashing in, not far away from it. Was there some kind of a connection between the crash and this object that was sighted? Is it normal that when the search team found the bodies within 24 hours, that they immediately needed to have them buried? And they said it was because of health reasons. But is that normal? I don't know.
December 1976, about 25 miles northwest of Whitehorse in the Yukon, on a routine trip up the Alaska Highway to pick up a patient for transportation, ambulance drivers Tom Danks and Ken Schofield observed what they thought was a bright star. They claim it came right down and began to follow them for about 20 minutes. It was oval-shaped, but they admit it was so bright it was hard to get a definite shape. It darted about, eventually coming directly at them. The ambulance began to malfunction. When they were finally able to get the dome red light turned on, the object seemed attracted to it, flashing a light back at them. It hovered close to the ambulance, eventually drifting over some trees and away. This was reported in the Whitehorse Star newspaper.
This reminds me of the case that was in John Keel's book, in which he talked about these people that were driving a bloodmobile. I think it was in Virginia, but I could be wrong. But they were driving a bloodmobile, and this object came up, and it had like retractable arms, and it tried to grab the bloodmobile, and then it was eventually scared away by an oncoming motorist. This case kind of reminded me of that.
January 21st, 1977, Pequawski, Louisiana. Edwin Meneses and Robert Mellerine, two firemen, both of St. Bernard, observed a strange object over the Dyke Canal. They were in a boat moving at a trolling speed for about 2 miles when a brightly lit globe appeared over their boat 75 feet up. It bathed the men in a warm, brilliant light. Then everything stopped. The motor was still running, but they were not moving. Then both men realized that although they could speak, neither could move. They wanted to leave, but were unable. Mellarine got the idea that he wanted to shoot at it with his rifle, though Manassas told him not to do it, thinking that the object might be government-related. It didn't much matter, as neither man could even move so much as a finger. Then the object took off, and the boat moved again, jolting both men back. Manassas noted that Mellarine's hair stood out like wire. The two began to move full throttle southeast. When they passed the Shell oil gas processing plant, they saw the same object hovering over a Shell refraction tower. They also spotted a lone guard on the bridge of the tower. They turned right on Bayou Laforge when the object moved to the water tower. It hovered there for about 30 minutes. A couple of nights after the experience, both men developed chills and high fever. Mellarine determined that he had lost 20 minutes of time and believes that he might have been taken. The refraction tower guard would later confirm the encounter to the St. Bernard newspaper via an anonymous phone call.
This case you've probably heard about. It's probably been covered on YouTube somewhere. It reminded me a lot of the Cash Landrum case, in that these two guys had this encounter with this object that seemed to kind of like paralyze them, and then not long after they got sick. They had like a fever, the chills. At least one of the witnesses said that he thought that he might have been taken. And it's interesting too that there was actually like 3 people that saw this, not just the 2 men that were directly involved, but another man who was in a tower watching it. So I thought that's interesting.
On January 26, 1978, Greg Peterson and Carl Burkhart were out snowmobiling the snow-covered forest around Grand Island Township in Michigan. They stopped briefly to take in the area. They claimed that a strange, hairy, bipedal creature suddenly emerged from an icy-covered cave and began charging at them. It was moving very fast, and they barely had time to get back to their snowmobiles and get out of there.
If you read J.F. Roto's book, O Train Bigfoot, in the late 70s in the Michigan area, there were all kinds of sightings of this white-haired, Bigfoot-like creature that was very aggressive, and it was like attacking people. This was just one of the cases.
On April 5, 1978, at around 10:30 p.m., Mrs. Mary Nutting looked out her bedroom window at her yew tree farm in Clockhouse Lane in Sussex, England. She noticed what she thought was a fireball moving across the sky. Suddenly, it took a sharp turn toward the forest. It apparently came down there. Nutting saw a sheet of smoke and flame, and the forest caught fire. Police and firefighters arrived on the scene and found 3 acres of forest burned up, but no trace of the object that was observed coming down.
A skeptic will tell you, hey, this was just a meteor, but the witness said that it changed direction. I know skeptics will tell you that meteors can do all kinds of things. It can change direction and go back up into the sky, and it can do your taxes. But we all know that no, meteors just go one direction, they fall to the earth, and that's it. Well, this witness, Miss Mary Nutting, said that this object had altered its course, it changed direction, and then came down into the woods, and then what followed was a big fire.
In 1985, West Virginia, newlywed Janie Carroll described staying on a rural property. It belonged to her husband's grandparents, in which a phantom car could be heard and seen. At approximately 10 p.m., I was lying on the bed when I heard what sounded like a vehicle trying to make its way up the drive. I sat up, looked out the window, and even saw the headlights. I walked into the dining area where my husband's grandfather sat and told him that company was coming. He told me that there was no one coming. I repeated myself again, and he told me that no one was coming. I told him that I heard a car, saw the headlights, and even heard a door shutting. He then told me that it happens often, that one will hear a vehicle, see the headlights, and even hear the vehicle door shutting, but that no one would be there. No one in the family could ever explain the phantom car.
Most of these phantom car cases typically involve somebody driving down a highway at night. They see brake lights ahead of them. As they get closer, the lights just sort of go away, or and there's no car there, or they're driving and there's something behind them and it looks like it's going to pass them, lights behind them, and it looks like it's going to pass them, and then they look over and it's just gone, and it hasn't gone down some side road or nothing. And that's typically how these phantom car reports go. But this one, I've never heard one where the car just kind of pulled up into the driveway and that was it. It sounds like it was a residual type haunt. Yeah.
Fall 1992, central Minnesota. The witness, then 12, claims that they encountered a strange object. What followed was even more bizarre. I was 12, living in central Minnesota on a beautiful fall evening. I was headed home from fishing on a nearby creek when I saw what I thought was a Goodyear blimp floating over our house. I started to run to the house hoping to catch a ride. Then I noticed it's not the blimp. I jumped into some brush to hide. This lasted for about 10 minutes. It was humming in an up and down musical scale. Then it moved north about a half a mile and landed. I could hear trees snapping. I ran into the house. My entire family was frozen in place. I was so confused, to say the least. Mom was over the stove cooking, but frozen. My dad and 2 brothers as well. No sign of my sister. I ran to the gun cabinet, grabbed my single-shot .22 with a box of ammo, then back to the kitchen yelling, "Get your guns, they've landed." My dad was the first to recover, telling me, "What's wrong with you?" It was time to eat. I couldn't sleep for 3 days. I sat in the front yard with my gun and up all night looking through my north-facing window, and on the third late evening, about 10 p.m., I could hear it start that musically scaled hum. It rose slowly to the edge of the spot and then shot into space. Upon bringing the matter up with his sister, the witness discovered that she had actually seen it land. My sister said she was playing on the beach and the object descended from a dark cloud and hovered above the lake, opening its underside and dropped what looked to be sheep or cattle into the lake. For about 3 days after, the witness noted that there seemed to be no traffic in the area. He waited at least a month before going to the area where the craft had landed. There was a large spot where the trees were pushed from the central point, and to this day, nothing grows there. The bare spot is even visible on Google Earth. The family eventually moved to Texas.
This case was on Steve Isdall's site. That's where I heard it, and I thought it was a really great case. It's like a throwback to the 70s. There's all kinds of weird stuff happening. You got like the object sounded like musical notes going up and down. You had like cattle being dropped into lakes. You had the family was like frozen in place. You have landing trace that's apparently still visible on Google Earth. All kinds of weird stuff was happening. To me, it's like a really great case.
In 2012, 2 female witnesses situated about 2 miles from the Colonial Creek campground in Rockport, Washington, watched as a strange 8-foot-tall creature walking on 2 legs with reddish-brown hair stumbled past them as they read books by a lake. The creature appeared to be twitching and seemed to be talking to itself and swatting at the air. The witnesses felt that they should not be seeing this. They also sensed that it might have actually been mentally disabled.
If Bigfoot is a real thing, which I think it is, then there is a possibility that these creatures are born with physical and mental disabilities, or they develop them. This case, which was in Bigfoot Horror Stories Volume 2, Stephen Armstrong's book, is one of the very first times it ever occurred to me that these creatures might have problems. And this creature that was encountered by these two girls sounds like it was schizophrenic or something. Like I said, I never even conceived of that these creatures might have mental or physical issues.
On a freezing night on January 3rd, 2016, at around 1 a.m., two friends driving the back roads of Smithfield, Virginia, observed three big white dogs standing out in a level field. They stood, quote, pristine as virgin snow in our headlights. They stared for an uncomfortably long time before moving on with an unnatural gait, necks bobbing low like horses. My buddy and I both recalled panicking. My eyes teared up, still do when I remember, and a sense of dread clutched my stomach. Neither of us spoke for a while, but later confirmed feeling we needed to get away as soon as possible, like it wasn't supposed to be happening or like we weren't supposed to see it. We lived in that area for a combined 10 years and never saw any white dogs like that around before or after.
This is one of those cases that kind of hits on something that people don't really talk about it a lot. And it's the reaction people feel when confronted by the paranormal. In this case, it sounded like they encountered three dogs, large dogs, and their reaction to seeing these creatures, these animals, was of absolute fear, panic. One of them was crying. They had a sense of dread, a sense that they shouldn't be seeing this. And this pops up in a lot of paranormal cases. And then you have the opposite, where people will encounter something that should terrify them, and they're just completely calm in its presence. And it's one of those things about the paranormal that I find fascinating. John Keel talked about it briefly in the Mothman prophecies, where he would go to a specific location and he would have this sense of fear, and he couldn't really explain it.
January 31st, 2020, WAB Utah. A woman, Nat, and her husband were driving down to southern Utah, partway into a 4-hour drive on a lonely, dark stretch of road in the middle of nowhere, when they experienced something bizarre. All of a sudden, we both saw a bright flash of light in our rearview mirrors without anyone being behind us. There was some sort of blur in time, and we just kept going as normal. The only way I can describe it is seeing the flash of light and time slowed down, then skipped ahead as if we had both woken up from a nap, only we hadn't really traveled much further on the road. At first I thought I just hallucinated it until my husband asked if I'd seen the flash too.
This is really similar to a lot of ET cases where people will see a flash of light and then everything gets weird, the Oz effect kicks in, or in this case, time slowed down, and then at some point it feels like they come back. It's like they're waking up from a nap, and this is described in a lot of ET cases. Yet this case, there's no craft sighted, there's no ETs sighted. It just sounds like they drove through something that caused this. A portal, I guess, you could say. I don't know. So that's it for this video. I know it's a little bit weird. I know this one was a little strange. It's because I've been dealing with a really bad cold the past couple weeks. I can't seem to shake it. I will go back to making regular videos, the type I usually make. I just thought this would be something different, and really, it's all I could really muster.